One of the privileges we have at St James is that Sarah Rater, who's at the back, is an artist, and every now and then she just comes up with the most amazing ideas. And a few years ago, I was preaching through Ecclesiastes, and I preached on Ecclesiastes 3. And next thing I know, Sarah's produced that piece of art that was over there, and I don't know if you can quite see it. It's over in the corner around there. You can look at it later, which just so beautifully expressed the sense of, in Ecclesiastes 3, of the boxing up of all the little seasons of life and the way that they're set up. So you can reflect on that later. I'm not going to read that whole section about for everything there is a season, turn. No, it's not there. But you know the song anyway. But I'll just read the bit before it and just the bit that frames it. So as the teacher considers his life, he begins to see that nothing should be done all the time. There is beauty in all the seasons of life, whether painful or pleasant. And as Paul has alluded to already, he suggests that his frustration might be a God-given frustration because God has set a sense of the eternal in his heart and made him too small to grasp it. A person can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their own toil. This too, I see, is from the hand of God, for without him, who can eat or find enjoyment? For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. God has made everything beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in the human heart, and yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end.
Mm-hmm. One of his big themes is meaning. And I think part of when he talks to young men especially, he says repeatedly when he's in a hall with 2,000 or 3,000 people, specifically when he starts talking about meaning and responsibility, the hall gets quiet, people pay attention, and it's often, especially in those times, that he's a very transparent man. He will be free to get emotional with a crowd, and I think that helps him connect with a crowd. Why do you think meaning and responsibility are hitting such a sweet spot right now, especially with young men?
I think the answer is that we're actually hotwired that way. As a believer myself, I believe we actually are hotwired to want to know what our purpose is, what sense we can make of our existence. Do I have any significance? And I think he's just belled the cat to a generation that's starting to feel that simply seeking pleasure has not worked. In fact, it's often, far from producing happiness, produced great unhappiness. Pleasure can be the real enemy of happiness. Yeah. And if you really stop and think about looking for happiness, in the end, it leads to something deeper. I actually want to know that there's a purpose to this. It's not wasted, especially for men as they move through life and start to reach that conclusion that it's not going to be as great as they perhaps thought it was going to be when they were 15.
Yeah.
And for me personally, I mean, I did something. I told something of my own story as a direct result of watching those young men that night in that audience, looking for what I would call a real meal rather than thin milk. Milk, as my son calls some of these lightweight milks. As I looked for the real thing, I told some of the grit of my own story on one of our government-funded television stations here. It prompted me to share my own perspectives, born out of tragedy in my own family, around the quest for meaning, because pleasure particularly is in the end pretty fluffy, and happiness is pretty elusive.
Mm-hmm.
Without meaning, it can be a bit hard to find a purpose to get up every morning.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How do you think Christians in particular should respond to this wave, which isn't there's no clergy that's prompted this wave? How do you think Christians and churches should respond to this?
Oh, I think they should firstly recognize what's happening in the culture. It is failing to deliver for our young people. They're looking for more. The second thing, they ought to be quite blunt. We need to push back against the postmodernists. I mean, where are they able to point to young people coming forward saying, you've lifted me out of depression, I was considering suicide? I've seen that happen. I've actually had people come to me and say, listening to the conversations has turned my life around. Where's the postmodernist equivalent to that? It's part of the challenge. Lovingly and firmly, we need to say, your superficiality is starting to be exposed.
Mm.
And the third point that I think I would make is, I think Jordan Peterson encourages us to seek the truth. And I think it's truth that sets us free. I profoundly believe that. I think we're over superficiality, looking for something deeper.
Mm-hmm.
And the quest for truth is important. He's encouraging us to take that journey.
What do you think's next for Jordan Peterson? He's wrapping up his book tour. Obviously, his book has been an amazing, near 3 million copies sold. He's hopefully going to do the biblical series. What do you think? You're someone who built institutions. I noticed, I think you'd had an interview with Os Guinness. Os Guinness gave a line that I use often, in that without individuals, nothing changes. Without institutions, nothing remains. So what do you think? Where do you think the path lies forward with Jordan Peterson, especially with respect to institutions?
That's a very good question. But as I understand his essential argument, and I think you and I would agree with it, of course we need to move collectively at times, often politically and in other ways. But the nation's only the sum total of the individuals that make it up. So to the greatest extent possible, we need people who are able to ground themselves, find resilience, become secure in their own belief system. And of course, you and I would advocate that that's found at the foot of the cross. And then, if you like, go out and change the world. So I think he's been active at both ends. I don't quite know what sort of institutional arrangements will follow or be influenced or shaped by what he's done. But I am very sure that there are a lot more individuals out there who will be able to people those institutions, existing and new, and make them more effective than they otherwise would have been.
Okay. Well, I really appreciate, John, you taking the time for this. Anything else you wanted to say that I haven't really been able to prompt you to say?
Well, just that I think it's fantastic that you're giving time to Australia. You'll love Melbourne, and you'll love the people who are going to be hosting you and listening to you. Jordan has shown us a couple of things that we can all, I think, learn from. One is he's been courageous. He's been courageous in an age when hatred bubbles to the surface, aided by, turbocharged often by social media. He's broken through that glass ceiling. You know, we need to understand what we believe, get our facts right, go out there and say it, and withstand some of what is thrown at us for the sake of our fellow men and women. And the other thing that I think I would say is that he's shown us the importance of being generous with our time. You're being generous with your time. And both of us, I think, have been inspired by his generosity with his time. And so, you know, he made a point when he, in the last interview I did with him, that sometimes you won't agree 100% with somebody else, and you can compartmentalize out those bits, perhaps where you want to talk more, but overwhelmingly, I think he's challenging bad thinking and advocating good thinking. And let's not run away from that. Let's take the opportunity.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, John. I certainly appreciate your generosity with your time and taking your time to talk with me this evening.
It's been tremendous. All the best.
Thank you.
What that means is that young people always have a reason to be upset and cynical about the current state of affairs. And it's that way forever. And so it's useful, I think, to consider such considerations or such conceptualizations as the patriarchy in that light, because it's an archetypal truth that the social structure is corrupt and incomplete. And what that means is that it's something that you have to contend with every moment in some sense of your life. It's a permanent fact of existence. And to be upset that the structures, the social structures, or even the biological structures within which we live are incomplete and imperfect, and to take that personally, that's the worst part of it. To take that personally is a misreading of the existential condition of humankind, because it's always the case that what you have been given and what you live in is degenerate and corrupt and in need of repair. And it's easier just to accept that, because there's also a positive element, and the positive element is, well, you've been granted something rather than nothing, and maybe you haven't been granted pure hell, because especially in a culture like ours where many things actually function quite well, so there's room for gratitude there. Even if it's a broken machine, it's not one that's completely devastated, and it's not absolutely hell-bent at every second on your misery and destruction. And it easily could be, because many societies are like that. And so the fact that we happen to live in one that isn't corrupt beyond imagining is something to be eternally grateful for. Well, so we live inside a damaged structure, and we also bear responsibility for that damage, because we don't do everything we can to constantly repair it. And you might say, well, that's actually one of the fundamental, people say, well, what's the meaning of life? What they really mean is, what's the positive meaning of life? Because as we've already discussed, the negative meanings of life are more or less self-evident. Well, the positive meaning of life is to be found in noting the state of lack of repair of the walled city that you inhabit, and then sallying forth to do something about that, to repair the breaches and to fix up the walls and to make the structure that you inhabit as secure and as productive as it possibly can be. And there's no shortage of opportunities to do that. You can do that in your own mind, you can do that in your own room, you can do that in your own household, in your local community. And maybe if you get good at doing it at all those levels, then you can start to look beyond that. And so there's challenges. That's the thing that's kind of interesting about this insufficient structure, is that it has a set of challenges built into it because of its insufficiency, and perhaps even because of its corrupt nature, that calls forth the potential response from you of heroic adventure. And the heroic adventure is to man the barricades and repair the city. And you can always do that. It doesn't matter what your personal circumstances are. There's always something that isn't right near you, isn't correct, isn't laid out properly, that you could just fix if you wanted to. And one of the things that we're going to talk about tonight is the idea that if you adopt an attitude that's like that, that the role that you should play is to make things better wherever you are, however you can, that what would actually happen would be that things would get better wherever you are in all sorts of ways, and that we've really, as a species, you might say, or maybe even as singular individuals, we've explored that rarely. It isn't something that's put forth as a proposition that often, and it's quite surprising to me. And I had an interesting experience the other day. I went to the keg. I go there because I have food allergies, and they're very careful with people who have food allergies. And the waiter took me to the table, and he said that he had been watching my lectures, and that's a very common experience. And he was happy about that, and he said that he'd had 2 promotions at the keg in the last 4 months because he'd been watching my lectures. And I really found that an affecting experience, because you might say, well, he's working as a waiter at the keg, and there's nothing particularly heroic about that. And I disagree with that, actually, because I don't care where you're located, you can do a hell of a job, and I mean that literally. At whatever job you have, you can take whatever job you have, and you can make it a real nice little piece of absolute misery. Or you can do act like a civilized human being and notice that no matter where you are, there's a richness and a complexity that's completely inexhaustible right at hand. And then you can take that seriously and you can say, well, I happen to be a waiter at the Keg, and perhaps that's not what I expected, and he's a young guy, and perhaps that isn't where I want to end up, but it's not nothing. It's a rich environment, and I can make it a lot better if I want to. I can get along properly with my coworkers and not gossip behind their back, and I can treat my customers properly, and if an opportunity comes my way, I can take it, and I can see what happens. And so he said that's what he had started doing, and that things were working out much better for him. He was in a much better job than he was 3 months ago. In 3 months, that's nothing, right? I mean, that's a nice trajectory. It's an uphill trajectory, and that's what you want, really. An uphill trajectory is actually even better than being somewhere good, as far as I'm concerned, because one of the things that really makes your life meaningful is the clear realization that you're headed somewhere better than you are now. And then it's even better if you also understand that there's a direct causal relationship between the things that you're doing and the steepness of that incline. And so I get a lot of letters from people like that, and they're most frequently young men, although not always. And they say, well, you know, I've been listening to these lectures and I decided that I'm going to try to take responsibility for my life, and so I've started to stop doing all the stupid things that I know that are stupid, that I know I shouldn't be doing, and I've started doing some of the things that aren't stupid that I know I should be doing, which seems pretty obvious, really, if you think about it. But obvious though it may be, that isn't necessarily what people do. And then they write and say, you can't believe what difference that makes. And they're thrilled about it. And so I'm thrilled about it when I get letters like that, because I really don't experience anything as better than a letter like that or a message like that, because it's so good to see things that aren't so good replaced by something better. And I really do think it's an open question. I truly believe it's an open question to what degree we could make things better if that's what we actually aimed at doing. You know, in some of the stories that we've covered already, the story of Cain and Abel in particular is really an analysis of that problem, which is so remarkable. It occurs so early in this document. It's such a foundational story. And it basically says, well, there's two modes of being in the world, right? There's one where you adopt the responsibility for living properly, for being properly, and you make the sacrifices necessary for doing that, and then everything will flourish properly. And the other one is a pathway of resentment and bitterness and rejection and murder and genocide, and that just seems exactly right to me. And so if the positive path beckons, if you can actually see what it is, if you can lower yourself enough to see what it is. Carl Jung said once that modern people didn't see God because they didn't look low enough. It's a phrase I really, really like, because people denigrate the opportunities that are right in front of them. And there's no reason to do that, because what's right in front of you is the majesty of being. That's what's right in front of you. It's inexhaustibly complex and full of potential, and there's no reason to assume that wherever you happen to be isn't as good a starting place as anywhere else. Now, you know, I know some people have terrible, terrible lives. They're in situations that are absolutely unbearable. But I also do know that even situations like that can be made a hell of a lot worse by the worst kind of attitude, that's for sure. So anyway, so that's where you are. You're in a damaged structure. You're a damaged structure. You're in a damaged structure. But, you know, at least it's got some walls. You know, you're not being fed to the lions on a regular basis, so that's a good thing. And you can emerge forward, you know, heroically, magically, to confront the chaos that constantly threatens the structure within which you live. And you can free something as a consequence of that. You can learn something. You can strengthen yourself. That's the other thing, because what you're actually made of, in many ways, what informs you, what you're made of, is what you encounter when you voluntarily encounter the unknown. And so the more you voluntarily encounter the unknown, the more you get made of. And the more you get made of, the more there is to you. And then the more you're good at encountering the unknown and restructuring order and calling forth proper order out of the potential of being. And God, you got to think, why wouldn't you do that, since you can do that? And it's an endless mystery. You know, I think part of it is that people Well, it's also encapsulated to some degree in the story of Adam and Eve, because what happens to Adam is when he becomes self-conscious, right? He becomes ashamed of himself and regards himself as a lowly sort of creature, and there's endless reasons why people would do that, because of course we're rife with imperfection, and so he hides from God. And I think that's actually the answer to the conundrum, which is that people don't aspire to the highest good because they're deeply ashamed of themselves and their weaknesses and their insufficiencies, and so that's not the only reason. I mean, there's the desire to avoid responsibility, and there's all the negative motivations as well, like resentment and hatred and the desire to make things worse. I don't want to, you know, give us too much of a break, but it's something like that. But it's okay to not be in a very good place if what you're trying to do with that not very good place is make it better. And one of the things I really have learned as a clinical psychologist is that you just cannot believe how powerful incremental progress is. You can do the calculations like, it's like compound interest, you know. If you make your life 0.1% better a week, man, in 2 or 3 years, you're in such a better place than you were that it isn't even like the same domain. And if you keep that up for 10 years or 20 years, you know, especially if you're young and you start early, you start to straighten yourself out and fix the things that you can fix, you can transform your lives in ways that are completely unimaginable. And God only knows what the upper limit of that is in terms of human possibility, because we are amazing creatures, you know, when we really get our act together and stop running at 10% of our capacity, you know. So that's what you do. You've got, you know, the fact that things aren't exactly the way they should be at least gives you something to do, you know, and that's maybe something great to do, because there's no shortage of suffering and trouble that besets the world that you could conceivably ameliorate in some way. And the utility and meaning, the utility of that and the intrinsic meaning of that is self-evident. So it also makes me curious about nihilism, for example, and despair, because I mean, I understand those emotions, I understand them deeply, and the intellectual mindset that goes along with it, but they just seem beside the point to me in some sense, because there are so many things that need doing that all you really have to do is open your eyes and look at them and then decide that you're actually going to do something about them. And you might think, well, what's within my scope of influence is so trivial that it's not worth doing. It's like, it won't stay trivial for long if you do it. Not at all, and I don't think it's trivial to begin with. I really don't believe that anything done right is trivial. And my experience in my life has been that anything I actually did paid off. It didn't pay off necessarily in the way that I expected it to pay off. That's a whole different story. But if it was genuine commitment to do something, even if it went sideways and the outcome was really something other than what I expected, the net consequence over time was nothing but good. So every new frontier that can be conquered is an advance forward, and there's no shortage of frontier because we're surrounded by the unknown, we're surrounded by our own ignorance, and we can continually move into that domain, into the domain of chaos, or we can restructure pathological order, and that's the secret to proper being. And so then you encounter chaos that way, you know, and then you can regard yourself as the sort of entity that, despite its insufficiency, has the capability to conquer chaos, despite the danger of that. That's the other thing, because the fact that you're fragile is actually a precondition for your heroism, because if you weren't fragile, then there'd be nothing heroic about doing something difficult, right? Because if you couldn't be hurt or damaged or defeated or end up in failure, then where's the moral courage in the endeavor? It has to be that the fragility is built into the courage. And so it's not a reason not to engage in it at all. In fact, quite the contrary. And so, well, and so then, you know, what do? Well, you put the city back together, and maybe the way you want it, so that it's functional and efficient and beautiful, and so that people can flourish there and flourish in a manner that makes them what would you say? That makes them feel that the unbearable catastrophe of being is worth it for the experience. That's what you're aiming at. And it's not an impossibility. It's not an impossibility. And then not only that, not only do you repair the city when you do that, but you make yourself the sort of thing that continually repairs the city. And that's even better. That's the end goal, because it's not the repair of the city that's the goal. It's the transformation of yourself into the thing that continually repairs the city. And so there's just no reason for that not to happen. And the more it can happen, the better.
So if you've never seen the biblical series,
there's a little taster for you. How many of you have heard John Anderson's story he was referring to? A few of you. You can go out and you can find it, about the very personal story that he told. He kept it quiet for a very long time. It's a very intimate story about a very tragic thing that happened in his life. And he shared the story well, and how it transformed him and how it made him the man he would become out of that tragedy. And Peterson continually tells people, wherever they're at, next slide, to sort themselves out. And you just heard in that little riff, and his biblical series is full of riffs like this, where he imagines, he says, you are surrounded by all of this stuff, and if you just set your hand to it and try to take even one little thing, even a little incremental change, and try and make it a little bit better, and then do that again and do that again, who knows where that can stop? Who knows what that can accomplish? Next slide. We've talked, our first talk, we talked about Jordan Peterson has been on a status rocket fueled by the meaning crisis and a culture war. And then we talked about why Jordan Peterson might be the most important person in theism, in the theism conversation since Darwin, immanent God number one and transcendent God number two. But is there something that is is there something to this that is in sync with a Christian perspective? Peterson says in his biblical lecture that everything he tries to do in his biblical series, must be practical. And he faults Christian preachers for failing to be practical. Now, it's very interesting when you listen to the story he just told. Is that practical? Did he tell you a specific thing to do? Or did he give you a direction of something that if you apply and try, might just make your life better? And when he tells, and many of the people that I've spoken with, the first thing they started with was stop lying. And who on earth would say, well, you shouldn't tell people to stop lying? Well, think about that, because we often do tell people to start lying. And why? Peterson says that meaning trumps happiness. Life is suffering, and throughout history, people have suffered for the sake of meaning. Women have given birth and mothered at the cost and risk of their lives. Men have fought in wars, given their lives in risky labor at the cost and risk of their lives. And that's essentially what Genesis 3 says after the man says, "It was that woman that you gave me." Peterson says, do what is meaningful, not what is expedient. And as I have spoken with Job and Dennis and Lars and Eric, for each of them battling with depression, battling with the things in their life, they found meaning to be a sort of internal compass that would help them figure out what they should do next, and also stop doing, well, what's the expedient? That's the downhill. That's the easy. Is it easier to make my bed or just shuffle off to breakfast and go to work? Is it easier to lie or to say the truth about how I've failed about something? What requires courage? Now, I think for Jordan Peterson, meaning is his sacrament. Now, I've just taken two words and put them together probably in a way that we seldom find. What is a sacrament? I talked a little bit about the axial age. The axial age says that at a certain point, people began to imagine if life here in this world is suffering, perhaps there is a place and a time where life isn't suffering. Just kind of the inversion of it. So this world is a place of decay, suffering, and frustration, And then heaven, as we often say, is a place of eternity. Where, well, what does Jesus say? Where should you store up your goods? In heaven. Why? Because here on earth, what happens? Moth and rust consume. The Apostle Paul talks about decay. Read Romans 8. The earth creation was subject to frustration. Jesus, read 1 Corinthians 15, Jesus is raised and his new body is not subject to decay. Heaven doesn't decay. Everything on earth decays. Those who have been following my preaching for the last 10, 15 years know I have a favorite phrase that the people of my church hate. I tell them we live in the age of decay. And as they age and they get a new ache in their back, they say, oh, the age of decay. Sacraments connect heaven and earth. In Christianity, Jesus is the ultimate sacrament. And if you read in particular the Gospel of John, Jesus is the man from heaven who comes down from heaven to earth. In the meaning crisis, so I've talked a little bit about John Vervaeke. He's another professor at University of Toronto who started putting his lectures on YouTube. Charles Taylor talks about the continuous cosmos before the axial age, where and usually they look at Egypt for that. And then the axial age hits, and Vervaeke says that religions employ what Vervaeke calls a psychotechnology to combat suffering with meaning using a meta-narrative. So if you tell someone you need to suffer for the Lord, well, where will your reward be? Where? In heaven. If you suffer now, your reward will be in heaven. So when you're suffering, well, those are jewels in your crown. If you're familiar with the Christian church, you have all of this language. It just rolls from your tongue. And this is part and parcel of this axial age technology because it gives you meaning. And in fact, the Bible uses these illustrations all the time. The woman who has great pains in labor anticipates what? The child. And when the child comes, well, I have 5 children, and after I watch my wife heroically give birth to the child, and I think, surely that'll be the last one she wants. And very quickly, the baby, oh, how about another? Oh, okay. What has happened in the last 200 years? In a sense, we've reverted to a continuous cosmos, which means that, well, there's no hope of heaven because, well, why? Because we can't believe that. Because there is no God and there is no heaven. And the material verse is foundational, and the story verse is things that these material creatures with abnormally large brains have somehow thought of, and is there an adaptive advantage to it? Perhaps, but fundamentally all there is matter. Darwin destroyed heaven indirectly. Postmodernity destroys meta-narrative. Every story you hear, well, Christianity is a story told by men. Well, they weren't particularly white. Later on, some of them were. Men in order to subjugate women. Stories are always a manipulation to employ power so that some may flourish at the expense of others. And therefore, all meta-narratives should be discarded. Except, of course, the meta-narrative I just told you, which we won't admit is a meta-narrative. Hence, the meaning crisis. All of this suffering you're doing now. I was just watching Ricky Gervais has a new, here's a Netflix. Is it on Netflix Australia, Afterlife?
Yes.
Watch that. It's a funny show. I enjoy it. I enjoy dark humor. He tells that little boy that is, anyway. But listen to Ricky Gervais try to explain what life is worth. Well, there's little bits of happiness, so there we are. Okay, what if your life isn't filled with little bits of happiness? Oughtn't you just to end it if it's just suffering? And so what effectively we've done is we've taken away this axial age technology that says meaning, well, why do men and now women go off to war? for the sake of their country. It's a big narrative. Why do many women sacrifice? I did a funeral a couple of years ago for a friend of mine at church. He flew me down to Southern California, and he's a big wheel and had all of his, political people all speaking at his funeral. And he asked me to preach. And why? Because he loved his mother. Why? Because he was raised a young black man in Watts at a time when most of the people who were his race and his age wound up in prison or dead, and she kept him away from the gangs. And she cleaned other people's houses so that he could go to Occidental College and then law school and then have a life. So that, I'll tell you, until her dying day, he looked after her because he knew what his life cost her. And he did the same for his children. That's meaning. And people will sacrifice for it. And that's powerful. And you don't need to have a whole story of someone who has survived the racism of Los Angeles and overcome it. You can see it, just like he said, at your menial little job. And you can go there and you can grumble about your work and invite bitterness in, or maybe, well, what we used to say when I was growing up, you can do it for what? The glory of God, no matter how big the job. And maybe your boss is a jerk, and maybe he doesn't know anything, but God sees how you do it. And he knows. That's powerful stuff, and Peterson knows it. And is there a reason why young men and women today who are told, well, life is kind of happy, and if you get the little bits of happiness, that's the best you can hope for? That's just dumb. What has the church been doing? Church planting methods have been migrating for a while. In the 1980s and 90s, we had the seeker movement launched by Willow Creek, son of the Christian Reformed Church. Bill Hybels created a safe space to hear a dangerous message. But if you went to the Willow Creek's campus, there were no crosses in the auditorium. Those were supposed to be too scary for secular baby boomers, so we took them all out. And the music was pop or jazz, sort of what you might hear in the airport, and we kind of put Jesus in the lyrics. And that worked fabulously. Churches all over the world remodeled themselves. And well, for the most part, the sermon was the same, but all the other decorations were different. In the 2000s, the busters, when they got their turn at the till, kind of turned it around, and you had Mars Hill in two ways. And the two paradigms were, in a sense, Rob Bell. Both Rob Bell and Mark Driscoll were born in the same year. Rob Bell sort of launched the progressive evangelicalism that has Rob Bell has now migrated into Oprah territory, into a more pantheistic mode. And Mark Driscoll, of course, took a hard reformed bent for the young, restless, and reformed, and went to full-blown complementarianism in one of the most liberal cities in America called Seattle. And a lot of people would look at that and say, what sense does that make? It actually makes a lot of sense. Now in the 2010s, as I was saying to Matt, he was saying, well, many of the churches here, and I knew pretty much what he was going to talk about, is the big sound, and they're pretty much following the seeker mode. And I told him, well, let me tell you something. Anglicanism is the new hotness in the USA. And you're like, what? Yeah, these old buildings that cost an arm and a leg to keep up, a lot of church planters would die for such a space. Printing out a liturgy, having a liturgy that you work every Sunday, doing communion every week. We planted a lot of churches in the 2000s in Sacramento, and most of them started with sort of the seeker mode, and they've all turned to weekly communion, regular liturgy, touching the water of baptism, the blood and the wine. What's going on? And then I get here, and it was so funny because when Warren, wanted me to come out here, I thought, oh, I don't know, Warren. I don't know how that will go. And then Warren and I have had a couple of days talking with each other, and what do we find? Oh my goodness, we've got a lot in common, and I hardly knew this man. And then he tells me about his journey through growing up in a dispensational church, and then into the Pentecostals for a while, and then he winds up in a place like this, and he and his wife sit there, and they just absorb the liturgy. And I think, wow, Warren, you've just traveled the whole trajectory, haven't you? You've lived the story. Weekly communion, baptismal fonts, liturgy. Jonathan Peugeot has kind of been my partner in crime in this, and it's a strange thing for a Dutch Calvinist who comes from an iconoclastic tradition to be talking with an Orthodox icon carver. And many, as someone said, many are I'm interested in the Orthodox Church, and I think, you're going to be pretty busy come Holy Week, because they're in church a lot. And it's all liturgy, and it's going on and on and on, and you might not even make the cut. And the interest in sacraments, well, why? Well, what has been happening? It's embodied belief, and you can hear that in Peterson. The church has kind of been floating up there and floating away, and we need Jesus with skin on him. Now, we hear this from both sides of the emergent strain, but something's going on in terms of embodiment and reality. David Fuller is the guy in the white shirt, and David Fuller is very much into men's work, as it's called, into Jungian archetypes. And he and Ali came to Sacramento to film me in my church, and my little church just didn't quite know what to make of these two guys from the United Kingdom bringing in cameras to take pictures of their little pastor in Sacramento. Every given Sunday, there's more empty chairs than that are in this room. And why on earth would he be there to do it? Because, well, they were into meditation and helping men find themselves and working through these stories and things much more associated with the New Age. And he listened to Jordan Peterson and began to say, there's something about story and narrative and incarnation and word becoming flesh. And he interviewed me, and he said, we talked about Jordan Peterson, and I said, there's a stoicism in Peterson that you have to lift this burden, and when you lift this burden, you feel meaning, and you've got to take up that heavy cross, and you've got to drag it uphill. And so David said, well, where's the hill going? What's on the top of the hill? And Jordan Peterson says, well, Paul Vanderklay obviously hasn't been listening enough. And I thought, are you serious? And Jordan Peterson says, well, the city of God is at the top of the hill. And I thought, oh, well, this is interesting. In Jordan Peterson's gospel, own your responsibility for the suffering of the world. A couple of weeks ago, on my channel, I do a lot of video conversations. Some of them agree to be made public. This is my second conversation with Nolan, and Nolan is in a wheelchair and he breathes with a machine, and I, who's in kind of a hurry all the time, have to pace myself because the machine puts breath in his lungs, and then he can talk by breathing it out again. And so I'm talking to Nolan, and Nolan says what his favorite book is. It's the Gulag Archipelago. Wow. You know the message of that book? That even if you're a victim of the Soviet Union, you bear responsibility for your misery. And I thought, here's a guy who probably, of anybody I've ever met, would probably get a pass on being bitter and blaming of others, saying, I need to own the responsibility for my suffering here in this body that cannot move to the degree that I can't even move my lungs to breathe. That's profound. There's an Augustinian anthropology to Jordan Peterson that I think is why it resonates. Because in a society where implicitly in our commercial activity, where we show people who are happy and healthy and young and wealthy. The only thing they lack is a skin cream or a particular brand of car, and then their life will be great. Many of us know that life is far harder than that, and miseries await us that are sometimes deserved and sometimes unfair, and many of them they will not overcome, and we live in the age of decay, and in fact, you will die. And Peterson is honest about that. And his honesty is refreshing to a world that hears a lot of lies and wants to say, you know what, life is hard. Ironically, Augustine's great adversary was Pelagius. And in some ways, the most common critique by Christians of Peterson is that he, in fact, has a Pelagian soteriology, or a doctrine of salvation, because pick up your heavy cross and drag it uphill to the city of God is his sacrament. And when you lift a heavy responsibility, you feel meaning. And when you set a goal and achieve it, you feel meaning. And this connects you between heaven and earth, and you have a moment of transcendence. You save yourself and the world by moral action in keeping with the Bible. Now, it's ironic to me that a lot of churches criticize him for that, because if you go to a lot of churches, that is exactly the message you will hear. But we're revisiting the Protestant Reformation, and we're talking about sacraments. And actually, if I had a fourth lecture, I would talk a lot more about Vervaeke and Jonathan Pageau, because the real flip that happens in the Enlightenment is the question of which comes first, the story or the matter. Are we material creatures for which we have a degree of consciousness as an accident of history? Or are we, in fact, a story being written in matter by God? What do we do when we celebrate the Eucharist? How you answer that question says a lot about the Peterson phenomenon. Is this the body of Christ? Is this the blood of Christ? I got into trouble in one video when I was a little dismissive of the theory of transubstantiation that I had been taught in my Dutch Calvinist schools and seminary. And a bunch of Roman Catholics pointed me to some videos by Bishop Barron. What does it mean that this is my body and this is my blood? Well, that's a very hard question to answer. It's a very important question to struggle with. We have a new appreciation for the Bible as a psychological authority. What does it say about the Bible if the Bible is true in ways that we don't quite understand? Meaning is his sacrament. Meaning is what connects heaven and earth to the degree that he believes heaven can be realized within his Darwinian epistemology, within his iron box of secularism. We were made by God, number one, for meaning, to be emotionally essential and pragmatically productive. And this is essentially what John Anderson said in the beginning of the video. When we sense meaning, we have this internal compass that says we're being directed somewhere, and it's true. And Peterson says, keep following it. The difficulty that Peterson has is, in fact, he still feels he's what I call an open agnostic. He says, there's no telling how high it can go. And when I, as a Christian, say, I think it goes all the way to a new body that will not decay. When pressed by Sam Harris, he'll back off. But you say, Jordan, that's where your meaning compass points. Salvation for Jordan Peterson is improvement in your individual life and the world overall. And I think Jordan Peterson's critique of the church is correct, that sometimes the church has let itself too easily off the hook. And a little bit of Jordan Peterson determination would probably be healthy for us. But you can see the tensions with conservative Christianity and its axial age formations. Neither he nor Vervaeke will say, can we really believe that those who suffer in Paterson, New Jersey, or in sweatshops in China, or in cane fields in the Dominican Republic, can we really believe that they will someday inherit the kingdom? And Peterson might say, well, if they're the best cane cutter they could be, there's who knows the limits of that. And that's true. But what do you say in one of my favorite illustrations in a John Ortberg book to a woman named Mabel who is in a nursing home, and she's blind, and she's got an open sore on her mouth, and the young seminarian that comes to visit her is kind of afraid to talk to her, and he sits down, and he's going to give her a flower, and she says, well, I can't see it and I can't smell it, so give it to someone else here. I'm already very happy. Well, why? And she begins to sing to him, Jesus is all the world to me. Now, in a Petersonian way, you could say she's making that cruddy nursing home a better place. Yes, but why? Because her frame of meaning is not limited by this material world. And unlike Vervaeke and Peterson, I'm not ready to give up on this axial age technology. I, in fact, believe it's true, and I think it's actually credible. The church, however, is struggling with what I call progressive liberationism. Jordan Peterson's rival is critical theory. He calls it postmodern neo-Marxism. This is the latest heresy, in my opinion, threatening the church. The church can be divided into oppressors and oppressed, always has been. Jesus came to liberate the oppressed, absolutely. You see the Old Testament prophets and Jesus in Luke 4. He comes to announce liberation. He absolutely does. But Augustinian anthropology still holds. Both Jordan Peterson and postmodern neo-Marxism, the focus is on this worldly application of existential suffering. Jordan Peterson is more optimistic. Both are adapted to the iron box of secularism and don't have any hope for Mabel in the nursing home beyond her cancer-ridden blind body. But both engage your evolutionary psychological meaning circuits. You think social justice warriors out there to destroy the gender binary don't feel meaning? Of course they do. It's why they're doing it. Progressive liberation fails to embrace an Augustinian theological anthropology. All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God and missed the mark. And Solzhenitsyn is right that the line between good and evil runs through every human heart. And it is to Nolan's joy that he sits in his wheelchair and ponders the ways that he must take responsibility for his misery. And I give it to that young man for the first time. He didn't tell me anything about his condition. The first time I had a video talk with him, there he was in his wheelchair. It was just kind of a little bit of a shock. I had to adjust myself. My second conversation, he says, I want us to be able to post this. And I thought, that's courageous, because YouTube comments can be a brutal place. Progressive liberationism looks like poison to the church as institution, which is actually Alistair McGrath's definition of heresy. It has a deficient anthropology. Augustine was right. Intersectionality means that identity groups can't build stable communities. We saw this in the United Methodist fight. You had the choice in that fight. Were you going to be a racist and not listen to African bishops? Or were you going to be a homophobe and not listen to American LGBT activists? You had to choose. There is no redemption for the aspects of oppression you possess or employ. Probably the best article I read in 2017 was this piece by Wilfred McClay on the Hedgehog Review, The Strange Persistence of Guilt. Because let me tell you, if you are a wealthy Westerner, your carbon footprint is massive, and they're perhaps is not enough space or wealth or resources on this planet to allow every African and Chinese and Indian to enjoy what you have. And this is the framing of the Western situation, and many, many people have no place to get rid of their guilt. Jordan Peterson comes along and says, maybe we need to think in a new way. How should the church respond to Peterson? The church looks weak and divided, but that's normal. It always does. It always has. I think about the churches that John writes in Asia Minor in the book of Revelation, and if you have any concept of the size of those churches at that time in history, and he writes about all the problems that they have, and then he basically says, overcomers inherit the kingdom. And nobody at the end of the first century would imagine that by the 4th century, Christians would have a very different problem in the Roman Empire of what to do with all their power, privilege, and position. But it happened. The main line is playing Me Too with critical theory. Fundamentalists hunker down. Evangelicals try to work the mushy middle. My preoccupation, as I mentioned in the first lecture, is will there be a place for Jordan Peterson followers who are God, Bible, and church curious? Because I dare to believe that what we're seeing right now are just first fruits. Can the church read the signs of the times and respond? It'll probably do it badly, but I think it can start. My advice for the harvesters are this: be quick to listen and slow to express judgment. It sounds kind of mainline-ish, doesn't it? You belong before you believe. So I'll have atheists running meetups for a while, I suspect. Invite them into your spaces to process. Free speech. Boy, that sounds sort of Jordan Peterson-ish, doesn't it? Let them talk through their stuff. Let them figure it out. Learn from their insights. We don't know enough. And here's the key thing. The harvest will teach the harvesters. And there will be new heresies. There always are in missional endeavors. There will be mistakes. But this is the path by which we do the mission of the church. How long should we go? Are we done?
My watch has just stopped. So my clock, my phone has just stopped. What's the time?
4:37.
4:37. Just one.
One or two questions? Yes.
Hey, Paul, what's the best category for meaning? Spirituality or rationality or metaphysics? What's the best place to put meaning? Action.
Peterson is exactly right. All of those terms are so conflicted right now for us. Part of the reason Peterson is carrying the day is he understands that the world is more a forum for action. And so when someone does something and they realize that made my life better, that's the kind of immediate confirmation that helps people take the next step. As preachers, we have to figure out, well, we're talkers. How do we talk about it? Well, that's our job to figure that out, and we're still figuring it out. And the irony is that Peterson somehow is doing it in ways that we aren't. And so when I started this project, it's very mercenary of me. I thought, Peterson's selling out buildings. I've got plenty of empty seats. Maybe I should learn and listen to him and figure out what he's doing, because maybe I can do some of it too. But it takes a long time to learn something like this. He's worked his whole life towards it. Any other quick question before we go on to the panel? Let me just say that this has been a privilege. You've been a wonderful audience. I have really enjoyed Australia and the Australian people. And what a gift to have gotten to know this wonderful man. And his book is lovely. He has poured himself into it, and I can heartily recommend it. So, thank you.
Well, let me say that the privilege has been ours, and we've had a rich feast today of your wisdom. So thank you, Paul, for all that you've brought to us and the energy and the grace with which you've brought it. It's been a great privilege for us all here. So thank you. We're up to our fourth reading from Ecclesiastes. The teacher in Ecclesiastes does not sound very Christian in this bit, and see if you can figure out why. He urges us to avoid all extremes. He says, basically, if you're going to be good, don't be very, very good. And if you're going to be bad, don't be horrid. But he also observes some hard truths about life. So from Ecclesiastes 7. Consider the work of God. Who can make straight what he has made crooked? On the day of prosperity, be joyful, and on the day of adversity, consider God has made one as well as the other, so that mortals may not find out anything that will come after them. In my vain life, I have seen everything. There are righteous people who perish in their righteousness. And there are wicked people who prolong their life in their evil doing. Do not be too righteous. And do not act too wise. Why should you destroy yourself? Do not be too wicked. And do not be a fool. Why should you die before your time? It is good that you should take hold of the one without letting go of the other. For the one who fears God shall succeed with both.